Today's scripture reading will be from John chapter 10, verses 11 to 15. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and is not concerned about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep.
You know how kind of some days are good days in the way they start, and other days are interesting. We went out this morning and had plenty of time to get here, and I mean, we were leaving about 8 o'clock and climbed in, had everything in my pickup, and sitting there in the driveway and turned the key, and nothing. And so I got out, got checking where the battery was dead on it. The only problem was my pickup was sitting in the driveway and the other car was in the garage. And so the only remedy is guess who gets to push the pickup out into the street and then get the other car out and then push it back. We did get here on time though, but I have had my aerobics this morning. So it's a privilege. I count it a privilege to be able to be here and to share with you, to be part of this series, to speak about leadership, to speak about those who will lead in the Lord's body. It's a vast topic. There are volumes of books that are written about leadership. There are all kinds of testing tools that you can use to analyze your leadership styles, whether you are A, B, C, D, Z, F, whatever type of style you might be. You can even take a giftedness analysis and you answer a few questions and voila, I'm a leader. But it doesn't quite work that way. Uh, I was first asked to lead within the Lord's church, to serve as a deacon at a very early age. It was right after the birth of our first son. I was 20 years old when I was asked to serve as a deacon. Had no idea what that meant. Had maybe kind of a business perspective. Really my first role was to just take notes during meetings, and that was my job at that point. But we do learn, and there are a lot of things. Paul provides for us kind of a guideline of what is leadership. As the church grew, as the word began to spread, and churches were planted and growing, as churches matured, it was necessary to provide the right type of people to lead within God's body. Timothy and Titus were assigned that task to appoint elders. But what type of people? So Paul would write to them and give them some ideas of these are the qualifications. This is what you're looking for in 1 Timothy and in Titus. He'll give that list of what type of characteristics to explore. And then if you combine it together, you come up with about 29 qualifications for an elder or for a leader within the church if you combine it. Sadly, though, churches tend to use these sometimes as a list of what disqualifies rather than what qualifies. Just for an example, have the list. You have a man who is blameless, a man who rules his own house. We go down the list, we begin checking off, okay, yeah, as far as I know, he's blameless. As far as I know, he's probably a good leader in his house. He has children who are believing. But, okay, if a couple has one child as opposed to another couple who has 6 children, is one more qualified than the other? Or wait, does child count as children? We get into all these kinds of things, trying to decide these issues. But long before Paul was ever involved in leadership training or preparation, God was involved in leadership preparation. I like to call it Yahweh's School of Leadership. And it begins way back. Men like Joshua, Gideon, Caleb, Noah, Abraham. As you go down through the list, and we look at how God prepared leadership long before Paul would ever write his list. A good example is the man Moses. Stephen will recount Moses and the story of Moses in Acts chapter 7. It's interesting, Stephen's perspective. He says in Acts chapter 7, verse 25, that Moses believed that God was going to use him. Moses believed that he was the deliverer. He had been raised as a prince of Egypt. He had been raised within the household of Pharaoh, trained and prepared from birth to be a leader. It was only natural that he would be the deliverer of his people. He believed he was the deliverer, that he was to bring salvation. And if you read in the story and recount it, he sees an Israelite who's being oppressed by an Egyptian. And naturally, he knows the only way to lead is to lead by force. And so he takes action and he delivers that poor slave. The only thing is, they didn't realize he was the leader. God had not selected, if you read it carefully, it doesn't say that God had selected him as leader. He assumed that position as leader. And we all know how that worked. He had to go fleeing into Midian. Leadership is not for the self promoted, it's not for the self appointed. I remember when we moved to Ukraine and we were there trying to get the school established. And for the first summer, before school started, I wanted to go around and meet all the churches, let them know me and for me to know them. And we went, and there was a man, well, Chris knows him, Sergei Poznikov. He was at the church, and the first thing he did was he came to me and he had his folder. He had a folder inside, had one certificate. It was his proof that he had taken a 1 week course from the Bible. I don't remember the book, but in his mind, that qualified him. And so then he handed me his business card. And his business card said, Sergei Poznikov, Chief Elder. Uh, Chief Elder. Of course, there was only one elder that it was him, and he had appointed himself, so I guess that makes him chief. Leadership role within the church is not for the self-appointed. It's not for those who are saying, oh, pick me, I'm the one to choose. It is also not a position. It is not an office. It is not a popularity vote. When I was a deacon serving there in the church, it came time that the church decided they needed more elders, a time to select more elders. So the natural process is they open it up to the congregation. And they ask the congregation to submit the names of those who they think would be fitting, would be qualified as elders. Well, it was interesting. The church there, they began the process of kind of looking around and trying to choose leaders. And there was one woman, a mother. Now, most every Sunday, she really had little to do with anybody. She hardly spoke to anyone. But as this process began, I noticed that she would be there in the foyer. As you came walking in, basically to greet you as you walked in, and she'd say, hi, how are you? Don't you think my son would make a good elder? I thought, you'd have to know her son, because he was the man that was probably the last one I would have chosen on the list. But she was campaigning for Ed and wanted to be sure that her son had that opportunity to have that position, to have that role in leadership, because that's the way they viewed it. It was a status for him. It was something for their family to accomplish and achieve. It wasn't a service, but it was a hierarchy that he was seeking. You see, Jesus dealt with this same problem. Luke chapter 22, verses 25 and 26 record a discussion, an argument that was taking place among his disciples. Jesus doesn't get involved in the argument. Matter of fact, later he'll ask them, what was it you were discussing? And they don't volunteer. I think they are ashamed of what they were discussing. And then he'll point out to them, the greatest among you is your servant. He's not the one that would be the leader. He's the one who will serve. That is the one who is the greatest. That is who will be the greatest in the kingdom. The one who is willing to give themselves for one another, to care for one another, to elevate others above themselves, and to put them first in their life and in their service. We go back then to Moses. We see Moses again in Exodus chapter 3. What's he been doing? For 40 years, he's been tending sheep. For 40 years, he's been herding a flock of sheep, not even his own sheep. They are Jethro's sheep. They don't even belong to him. He has really no financial gain or purpose or nothing, an advantage to it. He's just a shepherd taking care of the sheep. And the Lord will call him at that, because now in Yahweh's school of leadership, now Moses is ready. Now he understands. And he'll call him and he said, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, arguably the most powerful man in the world, a man who believed and fancied himself as being deity, as being God, a man who surrounded himself with all those who would reinforce his delusion, who would tell him how wonderful and great he was. He believed himself invincible. And this time when Moses goes back to Egypt and he goes face to face with Pharaoh, What is it he says? He tells him, the Lord God of Israel, the great I am, says to you, let my people go. These are God's sheep. They are his people, and I represent him. And he stands there before him boldly, confidently in what he is and what he's doing. See, leadership is about that. It's about caring about sheep. It's not management. Often we get this perspective. And when we look out among ourselves and we look for prospective leaders, who do we tend to look for? The most successful, good managers, businessmen, men that are dynamic, men that are charismatic, good leaders, good speakers that represent all the things in the world that we equate with success. But that's not God's leadership. That's not how it should be. I was preaching in a congregation and working, and it was one typical Sunday. It's a Sunday like everybody knows. You get up and you present your lesson. You've done the best of your ability. You give the lesson, the sermon. They have the invitation, and then as they're singing the closing song, what do? You go to the back. That's the tradition. You go back by the gate, by the door. Well, the gate, that's a good. You go back by the door, and that's where you really find out how well you did. That's when the little old ladies come up and correct your grammar. That's when someone will point out that you really said Abraham when you were thinking about Moses, or there's all those suggestions, kind, loving suggestions. But as I was standing there, an elder came over and he kind of stood by me, and of course he shook my hand, said, "Good job." They always say that too, whether it was or not. They always say that. But he shook my hand, and then he said, "Doug," he said, "Did you notice that woman sitting over there?" I said, "Well, yeah, I noticed she's a visitor." He said, "That's right, she's a visitor." He said, "She's here from another church. She's kind of looking around." He said, "She's very financial, well off." And he said, "We need to make contact with her. You need to meet that woman. You need to be sure you go by and visit her this coming week. We want to win her over as a member of our church." And I thought, okay, I know what he's got in mind is that her generosity could probably really help our missions budget. That her as a member could be a valuable part of expanding the kingdom. I don't want to judge a person's heart, but I highly doubt that that's what he had in mind. To him, it was numbers. To him, it was a budget. To him, it was a club, and we were inviting her to be part of our club and be a member in that way. I doubt that he had her well being in mind. It was really more the bottom line of the budget that he had in mind. And that's not what leadership is. That's not what it's all about. In the verses, in another example is David. David is in 1 Samuel chapter 17. At this point in Yahweh's school of leadership, David's a very young man, a boy that's there. He's gone to take food to his father. And if you remember the story, he hears this great Goliath spouting off all kinds of blasphemy and insult against the God of Israel. And so he wonders why. Why is not anybody taking action? And Saul will call him. Saul asks him, he says, "How do you think you could be effective against this giant? You're just a boy. You're not a soldier. This man has been a soldier from his youth. How would you stand a chance against this invincible giant?" Do you remember David's answer? He said, "I've been taking care of my father's sheep. That's what qualifies me." He said, "There's been times when a lion or a bear may come up against a sheep. And if they steal one from the flock, I smite that beast and I rescue the sheep out of their mouth. And if that beast rises up again, I do away with him. He's done." And so he showed that he believed in the confidence and the deliverance of God. He believed in the power of God. And he knew that God would defeat the invincible. God would defeat this one who spouts blasphemy against the God of Israel. Jesus said in John chapter 10, the verses that Timothy read for us, he reminds us, "I am the good shepherd. I'm not a hireling. This is not a job. This is not a position that I hold. I'm not doing this for the pay or the financial reward. I'm not doing this for any profit or gain for myself. I do this because I'm the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep." That's what leadership is. It's knowing the sheep, and the sheep know you. It's having an intimate relationship with the flock so that you know them. You know their hurts. You know their needs. You know their victories. You can celebrate them in the good and the bad with them. You're there as a part of their family and working with you. That's what leadership is, and that's what Jesus calls us to as leaders. Not to be self promoting, not to be good managers, not to assume a position, but to be shepherds that love the sheep and know the sheep. In Yahweh's school of leadership, he likes, well, I like lesson number one. Lesson number one is you love the sheep. As David loved the sheep, as Jesus loved the sheep, you care for the sheep. You be sure that as a leader that they know him and they know you and you know them. And you have their best interest for eternity in mind with them. And you're confident in your purpose, confident in the one that you serve. And lesson number two is that I think God likes on the job training. He doesn't take time. There in his school of leadership, there's no analysis, no testing, no really no books to read. He just simply takes Moses, lets him lead sheep for 40 years, and then say, "All right, now you're ready. Go stand face to face with the greatest man in the world, because you're a leader in the Lord's you're in the Lord's church and taking care of his sheep." He'll take a young boy and he'll say, "All right, you're ready. Go stand toe to toe with Goliath." And then depend and trust in God. Trust in the Lord at that point. You know, in the close of the Gospel of John, there's a beautiful story. In John chapter 21, we all know and we all read as the Lord came to Peter and came to John there on the seashore. And he begs to have a meal with them. And then he sits down and begins to talk to Peter. And he asks him three times to say, "Peter, do you love me?" And he'll answer him three times. You say, "Lord, you know I do. You know I care for you." We have a tendency to look at the vocabulary and study the word love, and we build our whole lessons. And it is an important lesson. It is a message of reconciliation. It is a message of reaffirmation, of renewal, of redemption for Peter. But what about the rest of the message? What did Jesus tell Peter to do? Three times he will tell Peter what to do. What is his role? What is his mission? What is the purpose that God has for him? From this point forward, Peter, what are you to do? Feed my sheep. Tend my sheep. Care for my sheep. They're not your sheep, Peter. They're my sheep. And that's your role as a servant, as a leader, as a minister in the body of Christ, is to serve and to feed the sheep. That's what leadership is really all about. It's not standing out front. The greatest leaders are those who are behind, and they lead in such a way that the flock, they think it's their idea and they think they know where they're going. They don't. It's that leader who's leading them, but he's not out front. He's guiding and directing. He's among them and working with them. If you are fortunate someday that you are asked to serve within a leadership capacity in the Lord's body, count that as the greatest blessing, the greatest challenge. It's a role for which I think we should all aspire and hope to have that position in that role. It is a matter of the heart. Just as in this series, we've seen that purity is really an issue of the heart. It's really a statement of our character and who we are. Courage is a statement of our character. It's a matter of the heart. It's an issue of the heart. Leadership is a matter of the heart. It's not a matter of knowledge or skills or vocabulary. It's a matter of the heart. It's a matter of loving people. And as a leader, we want to know his sheep and know them intimately. And we want our sheep to know him and know him intimately. And then to love them and care for his sheep, doing everything within our power for their well being so that they grow and they mature to the full image of Christ. That is our goal and our purpose in our ministry. And never, ever forget that we are serving a loving, all powerful God who can defeat the invincible at any turn, at any step. God bless you in your ministry and in your service to him.